All right, so good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see you all again this evening. Thank you so much for coming on this journey for me. For me, it's been a real learning experience. Every time I teach, I always learn. And so whenever I go and teach a workshop, I always tell the people who are there, I'm a workshop participant just as much as you are, because I always learn a huge amount whenever I teach. And so I'm always really grateful for this chance to be able to share and to teach. Um, yeah, so as I said yesterday, I went over time because I was watching the second hand, not the minute hand on the clock. And so when I talked about Tamar, I should have just stopped at the end of Judah, and I would have talked about Tamar this evening. So I don't have a lot more to say on this particular workshop series. I wasn't quite sure if I get to the end of the third week. So I'll just start where, as I said, the general sort of theme, what we're doing here, is looking at restoration of what went on in the Garden of Eden and looking at the restoration of these different relationships. So, as you know, what happened in the Garden of Eden, Lucifer came and seduced Eve and took Eve away from Adam. So in this whole process of change of lineage, then it's all about people finding themselves in a similar situation, Adam and Eve and the archangel, facing a temptation to do the same sort of thing, and this time doing it differently. And the best example for that, of course, is the one with Sarah being tempted to become the wife of Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world. But instead, she overcame that temptation and remained faithful to Abraham. So there's a few other little stories after in Jesus' lineage, which also are very ethically and morally problematic. So if I can try, I wrestle with these things just as much as you do. I struggle with this whole thing about Tamar just as much as I'm sure you all have done. And, with me, I'm trying to work these things out. And what I said last night, that was my best attempt so far at trying to make some kind of moral, ethical, spiritual sense of what was going on there, trying to explain what was going on and why it was significant and meaningful, and how it, was really meaningful in the life of Judah. And the result of that, he changed, which meant that he then became qualified to overcome his fallen nature as an older brother and as a younger brother. And therefore, by overcoming his fallen nature, which is laying the foundation of substance, he then qualified for his lineage to become the lineage for the Messiah. So that's why, because he had been able to purify himself of fallen nature of the younger and older brothers, and that kind of pattern of behavior, that pattern of thinking, that kind of tradition then was passed on through his lineage, through generation after generation. And we saw how Jesus was acting after his ancestor Judah, who was acting after his ancestor Jacob, etc., etc. So you can see here gradually how the lineage is purified and the attitudes and everything. And that, relationship which appeared really problematic with Tamar was actually a turning point of Judah's own personal spiritual life. And I think that was part of its significance, as well as the fact that, in terms of Tamar as well, the way that she behaved also was really significant and really important in terms of, what she could have done instead. So through that, overcoming the temptation that she had to preserve her life instead of preserving the dignity of her father-in-law, she also went through a huge life and death situation. And that quote I brought up a few times with Abraham. The father said, "Where's the change of blood lineage done? It's when people go through a life and death situation for the sake of God and the future dignity of man." And you can see here these people going through that life and death kind of situation where they're facing a challenge either to follow their original mind and conscience or to give into their fallen nature and repeat the pattern of fallen history. And each time they go through this, then they are eliminating various evil elements from their own character, personality, and that means that their descendants are born with less fallen nature than they were. It's a gradual, incremental purification, change of the lineage, first within it for an individual, but then it spreads out to a family, from a family to a tribe, from a tribe to a nation. and from a nation to a worldwide level. And it's taken a long, long time for this to take place. Anyway, so these are some of the other problematic relationships in Jesus' lineage. So what needs to happen here is Eve has to separate from Lucifer and align herself and unite together with someone in the Adam position as well instead. And so, as I said, not next Monday, because I need a week to prepare my next workshop, but the Monday week, and I'll start teaching a workshop on Moses and the Israelites. And the main theme of that will be leadership and community building. Anyway, part of that story is when the Israelites, they cross over the River Jordan led by Joshua, and they lay siege to Jericho, and they march around Jericho 6 times. And during that time, then Joshua sends 2 spies into Jericho to see what's going on there. And the 2 spies go into Jericho, and they find out the people are terrified of them. And then the secret police find out there's 2 spies. And so spies are trying to find somewhere to hide. And then they can't make it out of the gate because the police are there and they'll be arrested and caught. And so not far away, there is a door and there's a brothel. So they knock on the door of the brothel, and Rahab, who runs the brothel, answers the door, and she says, and they say, "Could you hide us, please? We're running away from the secret police." And she recognizes them, she knows who they are, so she takes them in. And she says to them, "We heard about how the God of the Hebrews, the God of Israel, and all the things that he did to the Egyptians, and how he led you through the desert, and we're all terrified, we're all quaking in our boots. We are afraid of the God of Israel because he is a mighty God." And then she said, "We know that, the Israelites, you're going to conquer Jericho." But she said, "If I hide you and protect you, will you guarantee and promise me that when you conquer Jericho, that you'll protect my family and all my relatives?" And they said yes. And then she hides them in her house. And then some policemen come along and they knock on the door and they say, "We heard those 2 spies came into your brothel to visit some prostitutes. Are they still in there?" And at this moment, she has a choice to make. She can either say, "Yes, they're in here." Yeah. And then they would have come in and the spies would have been arrested and put to death. And doing that, she would have saved her own life. Or she could say, "No, they're not in here." And if they said, "Well, we want to come and search your brothel anyway and search your house anyway," then of course the police would have come in and found her, and they would have killed her and put her whole family to death probably, because that's the way it works in these kind of societies. So instead of that, she, at the risk of her life, she protected these 2 spies. And she said, "If you're quick, you might be able to catch them because they were here, but now they've left and they've gone out the gate." And so the police go running out to try and chase them out of the gate and see if they can track them down. And so that's what it is. The king of Jericho sent Rahab saying, "Bring out the men who've come to you, who entered your house, or they come to search out the land." So she has to make a choice. To whom is she going to be loyal? To the king of Jericho or to the Israelites? So she says to the spies, "The Lord your God, he is the God of in the heavens and above and on the earth beneath. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you'll also deal kindly with me, with my father's house." So in that sense, she decided to throw in her loyalty with the Israelites, with the God of Israel. So in that sense, she's changed her lineage. She's changed her source of loyalty. She's changed the source of her identity at the risk of her life, as Ruth did later on. So in that sense, she's the one who's decided to separate from Lucifer, represented by the king of Jericho, who's a dictator, and instead to align herself with the people of Israel. And then when Jericho is destroyed, she puts out a red cord, a red rope, and then the Israelites, they spare her and they spare her family so they don't die. And according to one tradition, Rahab is mentioned in Jesus' lineage. I think it's in Matthew, And there's someone called Salmon who's recorded as getting married to somebody called Rahab. And there is one, some people think, well, maybe this is the Rahab who from Jericho. The other people who think, well, maybe it's a different Rahab. They're not really sure. But anyway, there's this idea that she was liberated and then she married an Israelite called Salmon. And Salmon himself was a descendant of Perez. 4 generations later, he was a descendant of Perez, who of course was the youngest son of Judah and Tamar. So in that sense, it looks like she married into Jesus' lineage. Again, someone who came from outside the Israelites, but because she went through his own personal change of lineage, personal change of loyalty, to throw her lot in with the God of Israel, then she got married to somebody, and that good quality then was passed on and inherited by Jesus' lineage. Then we have another example. This is somebody called Naomi. And Naomi was married, and she had 3 sons. And when there was a famine in the land, then they couldn't support themselves in Israel, and so they went to the land of the Moabites. And in the land of the Moabites, her 3 sons got married to Moabitess girls. And you might wonder, who are the Moabites? The Moabites are supposed to be the descendants of Lot and his daughter. So if you remember when Lot and his family left Sodom, Lot left with his wife and 2 daughters. Then his wife turned around, was turned into a pillar of salt, but then they escaped. And then Lot and his daughters, then they were living in a cave in a very primitive kind of environment. And Lot's daughters said, well, there's no men around here. They thought maybe there weren't any men, they'd all been destroyed, perhaps. And they thought, well, the only man around here is our dad. Or maybe they thought there's no men around here qualified to be our husbands, maybe something like that. Anyway, they discussed it. How could they have a lineage? How could they have children? And so they said, well, the only person we can have with whom we can become pregnant is our dad. But of course, their dad wouldn't do that. They said, well, let's get our dad drunk. So they got their dad drunk one night, and then one of the daughters slept with her father and had a sexual relationship with her father. And then she became pregnant. Then a couple of nights later, another daughter, one of the other daughters, had a sexual relationship with her father after he was drunk. And those 2 daughters, they had children, and the descendants of one of these daughters became the tribe of the Moabites by tradition. Anyway, so one of Naomi's sons married someone called Ruth. But anyway, time went on, and Naomi's husband died, but also Naomi's 3 sons died. So this was the disaster, because this meant there's nobody to support these 4 women. And so Naomi said to her 3 daughters-in-law, go home to your parents and then ask your parents to find new husbands for you, because I have no more sons, and I have, and so I can't support, who can support you? Anyway, her 3 daughters-in-law said, well, we'll, and she said, I'm going to go home to Israel to stay with my family because they can support me. Anyway, so 3 daughters-in-law, they escorted Naomi to the border. And then 2 of the daughters-in-law, they went home. And Naomi said to Ruth, why don't you go home? And Ruth said, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and here I'll be buried. So she also decided she wanted to change her identity, change her lineage, change the people with whom she wanted to identify herself, and to become loyal to God, the God of Israel, to Naomi's God. Anyway, Naomi tried to discourage her and said, I'm sorry, I can't really help you, Nigo. But anyway, Ruth said she would look after Naomi. So they went back to Naomi's hometown. So Ruth then is also deciding to separate from her just like Abraham, he left Haran, he left his father's house, he left his kinsfolk, etc. Ruth is doing the same thing as Abraham did. And then when they arrived there, then Naomi said to Ruth, why don't you go and collect some grain? And so the tradition was in Israel that when people were harvesting the crop, they were always leave some bits around the edges unharvested, so that poor people could come and pick up these kind of bits that were left over. And so Ruth used to go around gleaning and collecting all the bits of crop, the wheat, that the people bringing in the harvest had deliberately left behind for people like herself. Anyway, she did this for day after day. And the field in whom she was serving was owned by somebody called Boaz. And Naomi said to her, I'm sorry, why don't you, go and lie at Boaz's feet, and maybe he will, marry or propose to you or something like that. And so she did, and Boaz said, actually, I'm not Naomi's closest kinsman. There's somebody else who should actually take on the responsibility of marrying you. And so Boaz went to this kinsman who was closer and said to him, Ruth has come back. She's Naomi's daughter-in-law. It's the responsibility of somebody from Naomi's lineage, or from Naomi's family, to marry her so as to give descendants to Naomi's son. And you're the closest kinsman. Would you like to do this? But this kinsman decided he didn't want to take on this obligation. And he said, no, I don't want to do that. At which point Boaz said, okay, in that case, I'll marry Ruth. And so Boaz then married Ruth. Boaz was a descendant of Salmon. I think he was Salmon's son, actually. And so Ruth also, then married Boaz. And so when Ruth and Boaz are married, then this was the blessing prayer said for them. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman. So again, that was that sense there that Tamar somehow was a very good woman, regarded as being a very noble woman, and it's nice to get Tamar's blessing upon this. Okay, so a few generations later, Boaz, I think, was the grandfather, maybe the great-grandfather of David, who became the king of Israel. And David, so I'll tell you the story, not next workshop, but in a workshop after that. That story, it's a long story. But anyway, David's first wife was called Michal, and she was a daughter of Saul. And she loved David very, very much. And when David fell out with Saul, Saul tried to kill David, and David went to hide in his home. And Michal, again, had to make a choice. Is she going to protect David or follow her father's orders? So Saul sent his soldiers to arrest David and to have him arrested and brought before Saul. But Michal pretended that David wasn't there, and she allowed David to escape, and then she got into terrible trouble with her father. So her father gave her away to another man to be his wife. Anyway, so David then escaped, and he started leading a band of robbers, basically. And during this time, he is basically running an organized crime network, protection network, protecting landlords from various outlaws. Anyway, one day, David and his men, they decided to ask somebody called Nabal for some food so they could have a little feast and a festival. And so David sent a message to Nabal and said to Nabal, for the last 6 months or year or whatever, I and my men have been protecting all your flocks of sheep. So none of your flocks of sheep have been attacked, and nobody has robbed and stolen anything from you, have they? So in payment, I'd like you to give me some food so that my followers and myself, we can have a little party. Anyway, Nabal, he knew this was true, that David and his men had been protecting him, but he was a very selfish person. He got really upset and angry, and he said, who is David? I don't know who David is. I'm not going to give him anything. And so when the messengers went back to David, David was very upset that Nabal wouldn't hand over the protection money, and David was determined to go and punish Nabal. So when Nabal was married, he had a wife called Abigail, and she was extraordinarily beautiful, but also incredibly wise. So when she heard what her husband had done, she realized what a fool my husband is. Because of what my husband's done, we're all going to get punished and maybe killed. So she went to the larder, she loaded up a donkey with lots of provisions, and she went down to David and with a donkey laden with provisions and took him and his men lots of food. And David was very, very attracted by her, how beautiful she was, and he invited her to stay over with him. But she said, no, it's not proper for me to do that. I'm a married woman, and it's not good for you that you should be asking that of me. And then she pleaded to David and said, please save the life of my husband and his family. And David agreed. Then she went home. Anyway, over breakfast the next morning, she told Nabal, her husband, what she'd done. And he was so upset, he was so angry, and he had high blood pressure. And he got so upset and so angry that he got a heart attack and he died 10 days later. Anyway, so after he died, then Abigail went to David, and David proposed to her, and David married her. And David married Abigail. As I said, within the rabbinic tradition, she's noted for her wisdom, beauty, and wealth. One of the most regarded in the Hebrew Bible as one of the most outstanding women. She is very wise, beautiful, and very wealthy. And they had a son together called Chileab or Daniel. That was David's second son. The first son he had was through his wife, Michal. There's no record of what happened to Daniel. It's quite possible that he might have died at some point. Of all the women that married, of all David's wives, I would say she's probably the finest. But we don't hear anything else about her. Again, it's possible she might have died. It's a shame. But again, she also was put in the situation of choosing, and she decided to, between Nabal and David, she felt David was the better person, the better man. But at the same time, she was a very wise person, a very moral person, so she declined David's advances initially. Then we have this similar kind of story going on here. This is David when he becomes king, and he's already got a couple of wives at this stage. I can't remember, several wives. I'll go into that story later. Half a dozen probably, Anyway, one day he's out standing on the balcony of his palace, and he's looking out over the city of Jerusalem, and he sees a very beautiful lady sunbathing on her roof, and he's really drawn towards her. And so he sends around a letter inviting her around for tea at the palace. And so Bathsheba, that's the lady's name, she comes around for tea, and David enjoys her company so much, he invited her to stay over for dinner. And then after dinner, he said, would you like to have coffee and mince? And she does. And then he said, would you like to stay over in the palace tonight? And she agrees. And so they sleep together. And in the morning, Bathsheba goes home. And David thinks no more of it, although he can't really get it out of his mind. Anyway, a couple of months later, Bathsheba comes along and she knocks on the palace door and she says to David, David, King, Your Majesty, I have something to tell you. And David said, what is it? And she said, I'm pregnant. And David said, congratulations, that's wonderful news. And Bathsheba says, you're the dad. And David doesn't know what to do. It's really embarrassing for him. So he comes up with a cunning plan. And he says to Bathsheba, well, where's your husband? And how do you know it's me and not your husband? And Bathsheba says, well, my husband is the captain in your army. And he's been away at the front line fighting for the last few months, in the battle against the Philistines. So David says, all right, I'll see if I can, arrange something. So go home. So David sends a message down to Joab, who is the general. And the message says, please send Uriah back to give me some reports about how the battle is going. So Uriah comes back, he arrives at the palace and he has lunch with David and he gives long reports about how the battle is going. And then he stays over for dinner. And then after dinner, David says to Uriah, why don't you go home now, spend the night with your wife, sleep with your wife, and then you can go home tomorrow down to the front line again. And David thinks he's solved the problem. Anyway, next morning, David opens the door to stretch his legs, and he finds Uriah in a sleeping bag on his doorstep. And he says to Uriah, why are you sleeping here on the palace doorstep? Why didn't you go home last night? And Uriah said, how could I go home while all my men are living in tents and in trenches at the front line? How can I go home when my men can't go home to sleep with their wives? So David said, well, you better come in and have some breakfast then, and give me some more reports. So he stays for breakfast and stays for all morning, has coffee, stays for lunch, has afternoon tea with biscuits, stays for dinner. And then after that, David says, now make sure you go home and spend the night with your wife. And so Uriah goes out the palace. And next morning, David gets up and he goes out. And again, he finds Uriah sleeping on his doorstep. And he realizes, oh, that's not going to work. So he says to Uriah, come in, I've got a message for you to take to the general. And he writes out a message, puts it in an envelope, and Uriah goes back to the front line. And he hands the envelope over to Joab, who is in charge of the army. And Joab opens a note, and the note says from David, send Uriah to the place where the fighting is most intense, and then withdraw all the other soldiers so that he's killed. And Joab does that. And later on that afternoon, Uriah is leading the troops in the battle against the Philistines, and Joab tells all the other soldiers to fall back, and Uriah is killed. And then Joab sends a note back to David and said, I've done what you said, and Uriah has died, is dead. So what do you think about that? Not a very good way for a king to behave, not a very good way for anybody to behave. Anyway, so later on then, Bathsheba's pregnant, but then what happened? I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Wrong buttons I'm pressing there. I'll come back to this in a moment. But, okay. Anyway, so it's not a very good thing. So God tells Nathan the prophet, Nathan, you need to go and tell the king and chastise the king for what he has done. So that's the job of the prophet. The job of the prophet is to speak truth to power. Yeah, that's why, again, in Israel, the king has no religious authority. He is just he's the king, but he cannot make the laws, and he has no religious authority. And one of the jobs of the prophet is to be a social critic and to speak truth to power. So Nathan says to himself, well, that's a difficult one. If I go and tell David this directly, he's going to be so angry with me, he's going to have me arrested and thrown into prison. So I have to come up with a cunning plan. And it's really important when you're speaking truth to power, you have to make sure you don't get your own head cut off, because powerful people don't like to be criticized. So Nathan then, he comes up with a cunning plan, and he goes to see David and says to David, Your Majesty, I heard a terrible crime has been committed in your kingdom. And David said, tell me, what is it? I must go and punish the criminal, because David was known for having an incredible passion for justice. And Nathan said, just outside Jerusalem, there's a very, very rich man living. He's got loads of land and he's got flocks of sheep. And living next to this very rich landowner is a poor peasant. And he's only got a small house with a little field. And in his little field, he has one little lamb. But one day, somebody came to visit this rich man. And the rich man, he didn't want to kill one of his own lambs. And so he went next door and he took the only lamb that this peasant had, and he barbecued it and made lamb kebab for his visiting guests. What do you think of that, Your Majesty? And David said, that is an absolute outrage. How dare anybody behave like that in my kingdom? Tell me who it was. And Nathan said, you. And suddenly David realizes, oh, yes, I am that person. I've got all these wives, and I took the wife of Uriah, his only wife. And then David realized what a terrible sin he committed. And then he got into sackcloth and ashes, and he fasted and he repented. And then the baby that Bathsheba was carrying actually was stillborn or died. And then David wrote a psalm about this, and in which he confessed all the things he'd done and how unworthy he was, and this, that, and the other, begging God to forgive him. And you might wonder, well, that's interesting, isn't it? It's like this shame, guilt culture. Yeah. David felt very ashamed of what he'd done, but also he owned up and confessed. And the reason why we know what he did is because he wrote a psalm confessing the terrible thing that he'd done and how sorry he was for what he'd done and begging God to forgive him for what he'd done. That's why we know all the details of these kind of things. Yeah, because it was written down. Although David was the greatest king of Israel, in the Bible, every single thing he did wrong is recorded in detail. Yeah? Whereas in many nations, if there's some great hero, people like to protect the image of that person. They don't like anybody to talk about the bad things they might have done, because that's regarded as being unpatriotic. But the biblical tradition is totally different to that. There's no heroes that are not flawed. There's nobody who's perfectly good, and at the same time, there's nobody who's perfectly bad. Every single human being in the Bible is a flawed individual, and all the good things and the bad things they do are all documented after the time of Abraham. And that's the same even for the great kings. It's written down the mistakes that they made. And it's really, really important kind of idea of how history should be recorded. Yeah, honestly and fairly, yeah, without anything being hidden. And so you might wonder, well, still, that's very immoral. Later on, David married Bathsheba and had a son, the son was Solomon, and says the Lord was with Solomon. So what's going on here in this relationship? So you could say here, so how does one explain this? How does one make sense of this from a principal point of view? What's going on here? Well, how is it possible for David to have a relationship with Bathsheba and for such a wonderful son to come from that, who became the next king of Israel? Well, this is the commentary from the Talmud that the rabbis say this. They say King David was a great sage. David was very, very spiritual. He dreamed. He was even a prophet in his own right, according to the Bible. He prophesied. He wrote psalms. So it says that King David was a great sage. So when he saw Uriah the Hittite, he knew that he was the serpent who had seduced Eve. And when he saw Bathsheba, he knew that she was Eve, and he knew that he himself was Adam. So what they say is that when David looked out on the balcony and saw Bathsheba, he had some kind of spiritual or mystical experience. He had this intuitive sense that he was Adam, that he was looking at his Eve, and that Uriah was the archangel or the serpent. Yeah, that was some kind of vision or some kind of epiphany or some kind of spiritual experience he had. And he saw himself in this role, and he saw Bathsheba in that role, and he saw Uriah the Hittite in the role of the serpent. Thus he wished to take Bathsheba from Uriah. So it's like Adam reclaiming or retaking Eve from the archangel, because she was destined to be David's mate. And the reason Nathan, the prophet, chastised him, because he hurried and did not wait. For his haste caused him to go to her without performing tikkun or restoration. Okay, so what was it that he didn't do? He didn't restore the relationship. He made a mistake. He was in a hurry. Yeah, he invited her around for tea, and he slept with her that night, and she became pregnant. That was the wrong thing to do. So if he felt this, if he had this kind of intuition that he should marry Bathsheba, then this is what he should have done, in my understanding, my interpretation. the rabbis say that actually Bathsheba was still a virgin, even though she was married to Uriah or maybe even betrothed to Uriah. They hadn't actually slept together yet. Uriah was, she was still a virgin. Okay, so what he should have done is he should invite her around for tea, and if he felt that actually he should marry her, then he should have sent her home without sleeping with her, and then he should have sent a letter to Joab saying, please send Uriah the Hittite to visit me. I have important matters to discuss with him. So he would invite Uriah the Hittite round for lunch. Then David would explain to Uriah, last week I was standing on the balcony and I saw your wife and I had this vision. And I got this kind of vision from God telling me that I was Adam, that your wife is Eve, and that I suppose to be a bit more polite than saying you're the serpent, but that I should marry Bathsheba. So that's what I would like to do. But in exchange, if you let me marry Bathsheba, this is what I propose. I will find you an equally beautiful and high status woman to marry. I'll also promote you within the army, and I'll also give you a nice house to live in and a lot of money. And you can imagine this sort of thing is not unusual in the ancient world. There's even films about it today. What was that film, Pretty Woman or something? Yeah, these sorts of things happen. I can imagine then that Uriah thinking, oh, this is my king. He is a very profound, very spiritual king, and maybe this is maybe this is God's will. So yes, because the king has asked me to do this, then I will do it. Even though I'm married to Bathsheba, we haven't actually consummated our marriage yet, and in exchange, he's offering to arrange for me to marry a woman of equal beauty and social status and intelligence, and also to promote me and to give me some money and a nice house, etc., etc. And in this kind of situation, I can imagine Uriah would be happy to release Bathsheba and to allow David to marry Bathsheba. And I think that's what Nathan the prophet is talking about here, going through that process of restoration. Yeah, not killing the archangel, but winning the archangel's love and respect such that the archangel would release Eve back to Adam. And I think that was what it was about. I hope that makes sense. So this is the way in which I make sense of it. Unfortunately, David didn't do it like that, and it was a serious mistake. And I would say as a result of that, his family disintegrated. After that, he had one disaster, one calamity after another. I'm not going to talk about it here because I'll talk about it in my lectures on Old Testament history. There were consequences from what he did. But anyway, when you actually look at his other sons, which I'll look at another workshop, you'll see that actually his other sons were not good sons. One raped one of his sons raped his half sister. Another of his sons, the brother of the half sister, murdered his half brother who killed his sister. Another son tried to lead an uprising and a rebellion. Another son tried to make himself king before David had died. And you can see that, I would say it's a bit like Judah married this Canaanite woman. It makes a difference who you marry. And I would say the wives that David had married up until now, they didn't have children that were really qualified to be the next kings of Israel. Whereas if you look at Solomon, he became the next king of Israel and a very, very wise king. He is the author of the Song of Songs in the Bible. Also, he was a person who collected and wrote many of those proverbs. He, of course, was a flawed character, made some serious mistakes. But you can see maybe that's the quality of his mother that actually made that kind of difference. And that's why God wanted David to marry Bathsheba, because she was the kind of person who could be the mother of the future king of Israel. That makes sense? Whereas of the other wives he'd already married, apart from Abigail, I would say, and Michal, weren't really able to do that. And So there's always plan A, plan B, plan C, and yeah, that's the way it works. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. So as I said, that's the end of this workshop, this series. So I'm sorry for those of you who just joined a couple of minutes ago. Just one thing I wanted to show you. I mentioned this before yesterday. This is just this little project which I've been doing. Translate My World and I into Arabic. My World and I, it was this books I helped to write in Russia about 25 years ago. For spiritual moral education, then they were called Moy Miriya. They were distributed through schools throughout Russia and translated also into Azeri and published in Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan and gosh, I can't even remember all the places they are published and translated into and published now. So this is it here for spiritual moral education for young people in Russia, the former Soviet Union, based on a multi-faith approach to spiritual moral education, emphasizes universal values and virtues, which are more important in many ways, focus upon self-development, raises lots of questions, trying to get people to take responsibility of their own spiritual moral development and for their own lives, and to be, involved in making the society then live in a better place. There's also a second volume is very much in support of marriage and the family, and again looking at marriage and family from different religious traditions. And the whole point of this was, the whole pedagogical idea, I guess, was how to speak to young people in a post-communist society which is profoundly secular. No, you couldn't assume anything really about God, and the teachers certainly you couldn't assume they knew anything about God or this, that, and the other. So they came with this idea of introducing the life and teachings of the founders of the traditional religions of Russia. So that was Russia's neighbor. So that included Confucianism and Buddhism, Moses and teachings of Judaism, Jesus, Muhammad. And so through that, then young people were able to engage with and learn about some of the wisest people in human history and to be able to learn from them. So from that, it's a way of introducing moral values such that young people could say, well, okay, this is my opinion. But then they're having to look at the opinions of some of the wisest people in history and not to think that their opinion is of equal value or validity to theirs, but also to see that on many areas, these wise people, founders of these great religions, agreed about many, many things. And so if they wanted to disagree, then they could just disagree with the wisdom of humanity. That was their choice. Anyway, so yeah, so that was that. Anyway, I told you the story yesterday about how this got moved over to be published. That's the English version. Then it's been published in Arabic for Palestine by this person I met, I talked about yesterday, Ghassan Abdullah Khair. So we published two books. This was some money to raise for the first book, which was published about 4 years ago. And the second book was published the end of 2018, I think, 2019, that's the end of last year, that's right. And so just last week, the Teacher's Training Manual was published and being distributed on just digitally. Didn't want to print it, cost too much. Just for teachers, easy to give them a little USB stick. And so just want to raise 3,000 more pounds to start having teacher training workshops all over the West Bank. So Ghassan Abdullah, who's a very eminent person in education in Palestine and the Arab world, he wants to organize teacher training workshops in all the school districts and on the West Bank, and hopefully maybe in Gaza at some point. And so just need some money to fund and support these teacher training workshops. Anyway, so if you enjoyed this workshop, don't give me money. But if you'd like to support this project, I'll be incredibly grateful. Mike Balcom offered to fund 1/3 of the teacher training workshop. So he offered to match funds. So if I could find £2,000 then he would, from the European office, he'd support with £1,000. I don't have any way you can send the money to at the moment because the normal link doesn't seem to be working to put it into IRFF, who've been organizing the finances through their charity. But anyway, when I get that sorted out, I was just writing to Eddie Hartley about it today, so see if we could try and arrange it. Then I'll post the details on the Reading Life Through the Principle family, Reading Life Through the Principle Facebook page, or maybe just send out ask Matthew Hewish to send out something through Breeze, which is how you heard these, which is through which you registered, so everybody registered could get a copy of that. Anyway, so that's just that. That's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this workshop as much as I did. So I indicated I'll be teaching another one, so I need a week to spend some time preparing. And then from Monday week, that's 19th of October, I'll teach a workshop, same time, same format, about Moses and the people of Israel. And so the main theme of that will be leadership and community building. And the reason I think it's really important is because, for me, it's really painful to listen to the way people often teach about Moses and the Israelites. They complain, they failed, this, and this. But actually the reality is they didn't. The reality is in those 40 years of wandering around in the wilderness, Moses led them such that they built a community which has survived and prospered for 3,500 years. During those 40 years in the wilderness, they created a sustainable community, which is still going strong 3,500 years later, despite all the terrible things that they went through. So at the end of the day, you have to say that is incredibly successful. No other person in human history has ever done what Moses did in terms of leadership. Hopefully, true parents will be able to surpass that. But, just in that period of time, there's a huge amount to learn from Moses about leadership, all the ups and downs and the traumatic experiences he went through and how he managed to deal with them. And again, it's an unvarnished account. All the mistakes he made are very clear. And you wonder, how do we know he struck the rock twice? He wrote the book. Everything he did wrong, he wrote about it. So we can learn, yeah? It's all about education. It's all about learning from the lives of these extraordinary people. And then the challenges they face in order to build a sustainable spiritual community. Yeah, that's it. How to build a sustainable spiritual community, which can be a model for an ideal world. And that's what they were trying to do. That's really what they were trying to do. And that's what Jesus took up. And unfortunately, he was killed. But had he not been killed, then that would have, been universalized. To some extent, it was through Christianity, but Christianity became distorted in some ways, unfortunately. Okay, so I would like to invite you all to that. So you'll all get an invitation through Breeze when I set up the invitation thing with Matthew. And anyway, so again, once more, just like to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for going on this journey with me and making it possible for me to teach this workshop. And I really would love one more thing, for everybody to show their faces so Andranik can take a screenshot and so I can have a memento of this workshop and all your faces.